Scootaloo took a few steps backwards into the darkness and acted surprised, preparing for the trapdoor to open underneath her. She dropped down with great agility as the floor disappeared, and landed in a sort of metal cage a few feet lower. A cloud of dust was broken out and blown from the mine entrance above her as the metal press came down to fill the mine and cover the entrance. Scootaloo knew that for the audience, it wouldn't look like metal at all, as it had been decorated on the outside with what appear to be rocks and stones on them. "Ow!" she grimaced as she landed, the bars on the bottom of the cage biting into her hooves. She looked down and frowned. There used to be a large piece of wood covering the bottom of the cage, but it was nowhere to be found. There was a great round plastic tub underneath the cage, which Scootaloo couldn't remember seeing before. Then again, she mused, the wooden plank would have naturally kept it out of sight. She quickly tugged on a few key strings of her outfit with her teeth, undoing the knots one by one. Since those knots kept the entire outfit together, it wasn't long before she could simply shake it off. It looked very cool, but it sure wasn't comfortable to move around in. She decided to just leave the outfit there for now. After all, she wasn't able to go back into the dressing room until the show was over, and she sure wasn't dragging it around with her. She reached out to the cage door and attempted to push it open, but to her great surprise, it wouldn't budge. She pushed against it for a while and then threw her shoulder into it, which she instantly regretted, but it still would not open. Turning around, she bucked her hind legs at the door in an attempt to force open the lock, but she may as well not have bothered. All she ended up doing was sending more banging noises echoing throughout the area. "Dumb door! If I find out who locked this thing, I'm going to..." she hissed in frustration, when Cheerilee suddenly emerged from the darkness, Scootaloo's head about level with hers for once. Cheerilee simply smiled at the filly as she approached the cage, not saying a single word. "Miss Cheerilee, I wasn't going to say anything bad, honest. Just, I'm going to be very upset with the pony who locked the door, is all," she said sheepishly, as at least Cheerilee would probably be able to get her out of here. She started to feel somewhat uncomfortable as Cheerilee just stood there, unmoving, her features still obscured by the darkness that remained supreme under the stage. "Oh, I get it. It was a joke. That's great, Miss Cheerilee. You obviously haven't lost your touch for pranks yet. Now, could you please let me out?" the young filly asked pleadingly, not sure what to make of the mare's strange behavior. Cheerilee nodded enthusiastically as she stepped forward. A wide, toothy grin spread across her face. Something about that look in the teacher's eyes shocked Scootaloo deeply. It felt as if she saw nothing but hatred and contempt in those big, green globes. Cheerilee reached out for a lever on the wall and pulled it down slightly, and suddenly, the mass of metal above Scootaloo's head started to inch its way down towards her at a steady pace. The little filly suddenly didn't feel comfortable in the cage anymore, and she let out a little squeal of terror. "Wait! What's going on? Please stop! This isn't funny anymore, Miss Cheerilee. I want to get out. Let me out!" Cheerilee brought her face close enough to the cage to stare at Scootaloo, relishing in the terror she was inflicting upon one of the little monsters that had been tormenting her for so long. "I thought you wanted to get out of the cage. This'll get you out, you little weed. Just watch." Scootaloo's brave facade finally broke, as tears started streaming down her face. "No, you can't do this. Every pony will know. They'll find out. Applebloom and Sweetie Belle will come look for me, and..." Cheerilee interrupted the frantic filly as she burst into genuine laughter. "You fool. Those friends of yours are next. As for the others, you let me worry about that, okay?" You have different problems. Cheerilee nodded up as the wall of iron still inching down. There was now less than half the original amount of space left between it and the bottom of the cage. No! The little filly screamed as she lifted her front legs above her head, pushing up against the metal, threatening to crush her against the bottom of the cage. The press protested with some metallic screeching noises and shuddered for a moment, then almost came to a complete stop. With the machine pushing down on her and her pushing up to halt its progress, the pressure on her hooves that remained on the bottom bars of the cage was immense. She whimpered as the thin, rectangular metal strips slowly started to crack them, but she didn't dare move for the fear of being crushed. The machine did not relent, and the cracks grew wider and wider, making her pant with pain as Cheerilee stood and watched. Finally, she let out a scream as her hooves broke and the thin bars got driven into her flesh. Blood slowly starting to boil up around the metal and drip down to the tub underneath. Scootaloo bit down on her lip as she panted from the immense pain that washed over her as the blunt bars broke her skin, tearing and pulling at her flesh. Please! Please stop! Please, I'll be good! I swear! She managed to get out before the gaps of air and the cries of pain that otherwise escaped her mouth. 8 months. 8 months! Cheerilee suddenly screeched out in a fury, abruptly switching from laughter to anger in the blink of an eye. That's how much time you had to show a glimmer of intelligence, and you failed. In a fit of rage, Cheerilee pulled down the lever a bit more, and the metal pressed instantly, started to push forward, or down even harder, trying to crush Scootaloo even faster. For the good of all the flowers in the world, weeds like you must die. Scootaloo tried to cry out as the metal bars were driven into the fleshy parts of her hooves, the metal angrily coming to a grinding halt against the bones in her legs. But instead of screams, all that came out of her mouth was a disgusting gurgling sound, followed by waves of bile and vomit, as the unearthly pain turned her stomach upside down, and nearly made her black out on the spot. The foul and sour substance spattered all over the floor of the cage, and dribbled down Scootaloo's body from her mouth, joining the streams of blood as they tumbled down into the tub below. The only thing keeping her conscious was the copious amounts of adrenaline her body was pumping through her system in a desperate attempt to try and survive the ordeal. Cheerilee took a few steps back as the vomiting started, to avoid getting hit by any of it. That'd simply be distasteful. The machine continued pushing Scootaloo down, and she already had to bend slightly forward as she began hysterically pushing up with her shoulders and head as well, grinding her hooves into the metal below even more. Her hooves shook violently, as she knew they would not be able to take the pressure much longer. The bars of the cage floor ground against her bare bones, and they slowly began to crack. Scootaloo screamed in wordless terror, pain, and hysteria once more, her mind filled with only the red-hot feeling of pain emanating not only from her heavily mutilated hooves, but also from the rest of her body. Her throat was raw and coarse from all the screaming and vomiting, blood dripping out of the corners of her mouth, and her hind legs, shoulders, and neck were all feeling the strain from pushing up against the metal. Suddenly, the strain became too much for her little pony legs as the bones in her hooves snapped. The metal strips shot up through her legs as the metal plate pushed her down, cleaving through her young, soft flesh like butter, splitting her overstretched bones neatly in two. The new pain, 100 times worse than all that had come before it, sent her into a new fit of vomiting. But all that would come out was a puddle of blood that she spat all over herself. Her body couldn't handle the sensory overload as she teetered on the brink of blackout. but every new bone that snapped pulled her right back out of the sweet embrace of darkness, and the blunt metal bar shot up through her so fast, now that there was hardly any time to fall unconscious at all. Blood splattered into the tub, where it pooled into a large lake alongside various other bodily fluids. The more blood leaked out of Scootaloo's legs, as if she were an open bottle of tomato juice, and someone was holding it upside down. The room swam before her eyes, and she was too weak to continue screaming. Her forelegs started to give out, and would soon lose their strength, as she started to drift out of consciousness in earnest. Then suddenly, after what seemed to Scootaloo as an eternity, after the metal had broken through her first bone, although it was only in reality a few moments, the metal plate stopped pressing down, and actually moved back up a little, as Cheerilee pushed the lever up, an insane look of glee on her face. Scootaloo, now unable to brace her weakened body against anything as the metal plate slid out of reach, tumbling backwards to the bottom of the cage. The metal bars were still stuck halfway up her legs, holding them in place. Her weakened legs couldn't handle the strain, as she toppled backwards into a physically impossible position. And with a horrendous scream and torrents of blood, Scootaloo's legs simply broke off in the middle, muscles and ligaments tearing off of the bone as they broke right around the weak points the metal bars had created. She had thought the worst pain had been over, but for a second time in just a few minutes, she had been proven wrong. There had been a pain worse than what she had been going through, and this was it. She almost barfed up blood all over herself again when she looked down at the part of her mangled legs that was still attached, as well as the little bloody stumps sticking up from the cage floor. But she simply didn't seem to have any in her anymore. Her body had grown pale due to the copious amounts of blood she had lost and was still losing. And she'd probably die within the next few minutes, even if a fully equipped medical team appeared on the scene right then and there. Cheerilee stood with her left hoof on the lever, panting heavily and shaking with pure excitement, completely unable to keep the ecstasy she felt at her twisted dreams finally coming true out of her voice as she spoke. "Any last words, my little weed?" Scootaloo could hardly hear her through the ungodly amounts of pain she was in, as death started to wrap her in its cold embrace. Her body had lost much of its fluids by now, and she couldn't even manage to cry as she thought about what she'd like to say to Rainbow Dash, like being sorry that she'd never grown up to be the flyer Rainbow Dash thought she could be. Instead, all that came out of her mouth was a low gurgling and another pool of blood. "I guess not." "Who'd want to hear it anyway?" Cheerilee yelled, almost hysterically, as she pulled the lever completely down. The little filly saw the metal plate storm down at her like a battering ram, her body too weak for a bigger reaction than her feeble attempts to raise her front hooves up to shield her head. With a sickening crash, the machine pounded down onto the filly, driving her entire body into the bars below. The crash was so sickeningly loud that even Cheerilee closed her eyes and turned her head away for a moment, as she brought up a hoof protectively. She could feel warm blood spatter across her face and body, and opened an eye tentatively. The metal press was now filling the entire cage, and Scootaloo was nowhere to be found. Blood spatters could be seen in a wide radius around the cage, and blood dripped from the sides of the tub, making the puddles on the floor. With her legs shaking in excitement, Cheerilee approached the tub, taking care not to step into any puddles. For a moment, she just stared down into the Saguine Lake, amazed that there had been so much stuff packed into the tiny filly's body. Various chunks of flesh and bone floated around in the grotesque sea, like tiny boats. Cheerilee angled her head to look at the bottom of the cage, and saw little bits and pieces of Scootaloo still trapped between the metal plate and the bars of the cage. But, apart from those, and the huge scarlet stain on the metal, no sign of the filly, ever having been in the cage, remained. Cheerilee licked her lips, while surveying the scene once more. She suddenly stopped, as the bitter taste of iron entered her mouth. She had forgotten she got all blood-covered, herself as well. But it tasted surprisingly good. This must be what they meant when they talked about the sweet taste of vengeance, Cheerilee mused as she licked her lips and cheeks clean. She spotted Scootaloo's eyes floating around in the lake of blood, staring up unseeingly at the ceiling. She couldn't help but crack up laughing, and laughed hysterically, even as she went to get cleaned up. Even long after she had got the last splatters of blood out of her coat, the visible ones anyway, she just couldn't stop. She hadn't seen something this amusing all year. Cheerilee finally got back to her spot in the prompts corner, still giddy with excitement. She stared at the stage without really seeing it, and it took her a few moments to notice that she hadn't paid attention to the play at all yet. She was still savoring Scootaloo's last moments in her mind. She shook her head a few times to get a grip, and focused on the stage in front of her. Once she did that, it didn't take long for her to figure out what scene they were currently on, and she really had to suppress another rush of excitement as she realized that her next playtime wasn't that far off. She saw Silver Spoon, in her black noble's outfit, and Diamond Tiara, in the dark purple gown of the royal advisor, approach Reginald's cottage. Based on where the scene fit into the story, that meant Cheerilee had missed the scenes involving Lancelot's broken lance being delivered back to the royal court, as well as the ones where the king decided who to send next. Cheerilee didn't mind having to miss these at all. They didn't really interest her. She only cared about what was to come next. The pink mare was very happy with the set pieces that form Reginald's cottage, considering them to be very nicely made. Instead of an actual closed-off building, only the back wall and left wall had been put into place, giving the audience a clear view of the building's interior. She didn't want to praise her own work, but she was quite proud of the way in which she'd made all this fit together through her plans and instructions. With one care of caution, my dear damies, the great filly with the silver mane said, that's the only way to deal with a pony like him, if you don't want to harbor any hope of coming out on top, that is. The white and purple maned filly nodded thoughtfully. But of course, Silver Tongue, I am well aware. And of course, in our case, even more thoughtfulness is required. We're not simply telling him to stand down, after all. The two ponies exchanged grins as they walked down the path toward Reginald's front door, which was placed in the wall to the right side of the house. Of course, the wall itself hadn't been built on stage, but the audience got the idea behind it easily enough. The two fillies nodded back and forth in front of the door, until Silver Tongue finally leaned forward with a sigh and knocked on the door. The audience could see a small door open at the back of Reginald's house, as the antagonist himself stepped through to his living room, carrying a teapot, which he put down onto the table in the center of the room, next to 3 cups that were already there. Visitors at this hour? I wondered who they could be, the villain said louder than was perhaps needed, with a fourth wall-breaking wink at the audience. He strolled over to the door and opened it, but he left the door chain in place. Yes, he asked, while peeping through a small opening he had created. I wasn't expecting any visitors today. Forget the pleasantries, Reginald dear, the Silvermane filly said. We know who you are, and we know you know who we are. Diamis finished the sentence for her companion. Reginald's frown was clearly visible even to the people in the back of the theater. Then why knock? Surely you don't believe I'd let you in just so you could apprehend me. The pair of fillies laughed. Apprehend you? No, my dear, you have this all wrong. We don't want to apprehend you. We want to work with you. To take care of the king, once and for all. The fillies remained silent for a moment before Diamis added, We know you're a reasonable guy, Reginald, and this will be beneficial for you as well. Reginald closed the door and took the chain off before opening it fully. All right, come in, he said as he walked to the table in the middle of the room. He grabbed the teapot that stood there by the ear, carefully pouring tea into the 3 cups on the table. Let's hear what you have to say, then, he said as he started sipping one of the cups. The 2 gathered around the table as well, each in front of the other 2 cups, which they had stared at with suspicion. How exactly do we know you haven't poisoned these? Silvertongue demanded. How do you know I didn't poison the tea I prepared without knowing you'd come and that I'm drinking myself? Reginald mockingly replied. The other 2 seemed to relax at this train of thought, sipping from their mugs slowly. It had been a rather long trip, and as the ladies of style did, they enjoyed their daily cup of teas. Diamis opened her mouth to start negotiations, when she suddenly fell silent and stared at the cups on the table. 3 cups. If you didn't know we were coming, why are there 3? She started before pressing a hoof up against her head as she took an unsteady step back from the table. Oh, stars! You did poison us! But you drank... How? Silver started shaking as she sank to her knees. It was in the cups, not in the tea, Snips described as he took another sip. The 2 fillies were swaying about theoretically now, until Diamis suddenly blurted out, Wait, my head. It was really poisoned? Before both she and Silver toppled over to the ground. Really poisoned it? Snip said in confusion. That wasn't in the script. He walked over to a metal ring on the floor and grabbed it between his teeth, pulling it up to reveal a trapdoor. He dragged the perfectly still fillies into the trapdoor one at a time, throwing them into the hole before closing it again. And there they'll rot. Reginald doesn't deal with traitors. They're too traitorous, he mused as he excitedly exited the stage through the door in the back of the house, and the stage lights slowly going out. By the time the curtains closed, and the lights above the audience went on to signal the halftime break, Cheerilee was already long gone from her seat in the prompts corner, making her way to an unknown destination under the stage.